The U.S. should keep its nose out of the Middle East, and they're trying to broker a ceasefire, and it's premature. The Hamas said, we're not going to have anything to do with the ceasefire. They're just firing more rockets and more terrorist attacks on their cities, and Israel said, we've got to stop it. And so we sound really impotent in this whole deal, but they keep on trying.
Yeah, nevertheless, Secretary of State John Kerry landed at Ben Gurion Airport today for more peace talks, even though the FAA said no U.S. flights could land there for now after a Hamas rocket attack. Chris Mitchell brings us the story from Tel Aviv.
The FAA banned flights to Israel after a Hamas rocket made a direct hit on a home in a town next to Israel's Ben Gurion Airport. This follows heightened concerns after the Malaysian airliner was shot down over Ukraine. This is the arrivals hall at Ben Gurion Airport. Usually there's hundreds of people here waiting for family or friends, but now it's nearly deserted. The last time this many flights were canceled because of war was back in 1991 during the first Gulf War.
Right now we've got a lot of passengers stuck abroad with American Airlines and European Airlines. I think as a solidarity you should come here. There is no reason to give up to the Hamas and close the Israeli airport.
Transportation Minister Yaakov Katz said there's no reason to stop flights to and from Ben Gurion because it's a secure airport. Thousands of passengers were stranded overnight at Israel's Ben Gurion Airport and elsewhere on their way to Israel. David Maimon, president of Israel's national airline, El Al, says they'll do what they can to pick up the slack.
Increase the frequency of the flights, and we do everything that we can do to bring the passengers back to home.
Meanwhile, the international community is scrambling to get a ceasefire, but the battle continues. 2 Israeli soldiers were killed overnight in Gaza. Israel struck some 200 targets in 24 hours, including 100 in the Hamas stronghold of Sajaya.
We are striking Hamas in its rocket capabilities, its tunnel capabilities. We've exposed over 23 tunnels.
Still, Hamas continued to fire rockets at Israel on Wednesday. The IDF also released these maps showing how Hamas is entrenched in civilian areas as the death toll climbed above 600. They released this footage showing 2 terrorists escaping in an ambulance. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on Tuesday condemned the use of civilians as human shields, but urged the 2 sides to reconcile.
Stop fighting, start talking, and take on the root causes of the conflict so we are not back to the same situation in another 6 months or a year.
What grievance can we solve for Hamas? Their grievance is that we exist. They don't even want a 2-state solution. They don't want any state solutions.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Ben Gurion Airport, Tel Aviv.
You know, some years ago, I was riding with an Israeli official in a helicopter along the border fence and looking down, and we got to a point where we could look right down into the major runway at Ben Gurion Airport. And I thought, we're over Arab-controlled territory, and it would be so easy to fire any kind of a missile or artillery shell down there and interrupt flights. But, you know, Hamas has really won a tremendous victory without doing anything by the action of our FAA, limiting flights. You know, 1 missile, I mean, so the missile comes. I think an airplane could take an avoidance procedure against something like that, but they're the most vulnerable when they land and when they take off. And I don't know, it's just something that this is a death blow to Israel to cut off their air flow of passengers during the height of the tourist season. It just is a win for Hamas. It shouldn't be. But years and years ago, there was so-called Oslo Accords, and the then Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, gave the Palestinians everything they asked for. And Yasser Arafat turned it down and launched the so-called Intifada. Why? because they don't want peace. They want the destruction of Israel. And for that guy from the UN to say, get to the underlying causes. The underlying cause is that Hamas is a terrorist group and they want to destroy Israel. That's the underlying cause, and Israel can't let it happen. So if a robber holds you up in the street and wants to blow your brains off, you say, well, what's the underlying cause of the fact you resist him? Well, I'm trying to fight for my life. Well, could the fighting in Israel spread and become an even wider conflict? Well, it looks like the answer could be yes, and John Jessup has more on that story from Washington.
Pat, there are growing fears of a new uprising against Israel among Palestinians in the West Bank. George Thomas is in Bethlehem and shows us how one church is trying to ease the tension.
46 miles away from Israel's offensive against Hamas in Gaza, there's another battle some say is being dangerously ignored by the world.
But my big concern right now is this, is that the West Bank is being neglected. With the riots are being done every single night, almost now 13, 14 nights in a row. Focused on Gaza.
Stephen Curry, a prominent Christian Arab who lives in Bethlehem, worries the area is ripe for another uprising.
I was born in Jerusalem. I grew up in Bethlehem. I remember how the first and second Intifada started, and I'm seeing in this an evidence of a possible another outbreak of an Intifada happening in the West Bank.
Here on the streets, Palestinian protesters, angry about Israel's war on Hamas, are running daily skirmishes with Israeli soldiers and Palestinian Authority police. Several people have been killed and injured. This is a security wall that divides Israel and the West Bank. For nearly 2 weeks, there have been violent protests taking place right here on the street, as well as in other West Bank cities such as Hebron, Nablus, and Ramallah. Neither Israel nor the Palestinian Authority want to see another front of the war open in the West Bank.
We are delighted to have
Colonel Peter Lerner is Israel Defense Forces spokesman.
We need to try and keep it calm and keep it controlled. It might not be possible.
To avoid further violence, Curry, who helps lead a prominent church in Bethlehem, is calling on his people to de-escalate the tensions.
In Ecclesiastes, it says there's a time to mourn, a time to laugh, and a time to dance. This is a time, I believe, for neither three. This is a time where we need to be people, are peacemakers. We need to be a voice, a balanced, a righteous voice in the midst of a wilderness.
For several weeks now, his church has been distributing copies of the New Testament and bottles of water wrapped with the scripture verse, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God."
We need to preach love, forgiveness, acceptance. We need to preach the message of do not fight, do not be overcome evil with evil, but overcome evil with good.
In the meantime, the U.S. State Department is warning Americans to avoid travel to Bethlehem and other cities in the West Bank because of ongoing hostilities in the region. George Thomas, CBN News, Bethlehem.
Here at home, a new ruling by a federal appeals court could deal a major blow to Obamacare. And as Caitlin Burke reports, it may mean that millions of people who signed up will be paying much more for their coverage.
When Obamacare was first pitched to low and middle income people, the plans offered on healthcare.gov were only affordable because of subsidies. That's federal aid to help pay the premium. But the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit ruled that for 36 states, those subsidies are illegal. The healthcare law says the government can only provide subsidies for healthcare bought on the state exchanges or online marketplaces. But 36 states were either unable or unwilling to set up those exchanges that would have made them eligible for subsidies. So the IRS set up a rule that allowed the federal government to pay the subsidies.
The IRS has already been relatively politicized, was trying to cover for the administration here in a law that was possibly just poorly drafted. Possibly they thought all the states really would enact these exchanges.
The D.C. court ruled that the IRS action went beyond the law, and so the federal government can't legally pay out the subsidies, which could make Obamacare policies too expensive for people who depended on that money from Washington. Meanwhile, a Virginia federal court came out with a different ruling. It said the IRS correctly interpreted the will of Congress by allowing subsidies in all 50 states. Now it appears that once again, the fate of Obamacare is likely to be in the hands of the Supreme Court.
I think there's a good chance that the Supreme Court will come to the common sense conclusion that this is another example where federal does not mean state. You can't rewrite this law just to make it say what you wish it had said.
Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
Pat, fallout from this health care law is still far from over.
You know, I'm surprised at the Fourth Circuit, which is a relatively conservative court sitting in Richmond, Virginia, that they would have come down in favor of this. And what they were doing is, well, reasonable people would have obviously intended that this would be there. Look, that law was written by Congress. It was written by Democrats. There wasn't one Republican vote for it. Everyone is written by Democrats. They knew exactly what they were doing. They had an expressed desire to exclude certain things and include certain things. And for a court to say, well, obviously intelligent people would have included, you can't do that. I mean, they write a law and the words have to mean something. And the D.C. Circuit got it right. And now the two, they've got a conflict in the circuits. They'll, of course, immediately go up to the Supreme Court. How soon they'll act, we don't know. But I think the people should be tired of having courts and the president arbitrarily rewrite this law. It was written by the staffers. It was written by congressmen. It was written by Democrats who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what those words meant, and they did it for a purpose. And for a court to come in and say, well, reasonable people would have obviously included X, Y, and Z, that's nonsense. The D.C. Circuit got it right, and let's hope their reasoning prevails. John?
Pat, Congress is set to hold a hearing on why Miriam Ibrahim is still stuck in Sudan. New Jersey Congressman Chris Smith is chairing today's hearing. He says there's a new push to put the Christian mother of two back in prison. Ibrahim had been sentenced to death for marrying a Christian and abandoning the Muslim faith. A judge dropped the sentence after an international outcry, but she hasn't yet been able to get out of the country. She and her family are now holed up in the U.S. Embassy in Khartoum, where they're waiting for permission to fly to the U.S. Her husband, Daniel, is an American citizen. The rate of childhood obesity leveled off in the last decade or so, suggesting kids aren't getting any fatter, but too many are still overweight. A new study from the University of Minnesota found the rate of childhood obesity in the U.S. remained flat from 2003 to 2012. Nearly 1 in 5 American kids from 2 to 18 are considered obese, and that's still too high because obesity could lead to severe health consequences for overweight kids in the future, including type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and other problems. Experts say schools and parents need to help kids eat the right foods and avoid the wrong ones. Pat, what's it going to take to tackle this epidemic?
Put parents in concentration camps and force them to learn. You know, they don't know nutrition. I tell you, I've seen parents buy the most unbelievable stuff for their kids. You see, it's like if you own a dog and the little dog looks at you with those pleading eyes, oh, wouldn't you give me a little something? And you say, well, Fido is such a sweet thing, I'd better just throw him something. And the next thing you know, Fido gets fat as a pig, and his heart is giving out, and he might die at an early age. Well, it's the same thing with little Johnny. Little Johnny looks so appealing, and you can keep him quiet if you shove something sweet in his mouth, and you want him to, you know, get off your case so you can do whatever you're doing. And this is a bribe. And we keep giving these kids, well, I want sugar pops, or I want whatever they give. I want a Happy Meal from McDonald's.
And don't you think, too, they're spending so much time now on their Kindles in front of the TV, watching videos, and their parents are letting the TV babysit them instead of getting outside and throwing the football.
Oh, of course, and there's none of, but the parents, they don't know what is good nutrition.
Yeah.
They don't understand it. You've got to feed them vegetables. You've got to feed them fruit, and you've got to feed them protein.
And not Fruit Loops.
And not Fruit Loops, and not all the sweet things. But the cereal makers of America are in a conspiracy, if I can use that term, to put sugar into cereals so that little Johnny will want more of them, and they will cry for this because that's what they want. A little child doesn't have sophisticated taste buds, and if you don't give them a taste for salt and sugar and these things, their taste buds will get taste from the natural food. But once you start loading it down, then you immediately train their taste buds that I've got to have more sugar, I've got to have more salt, and they get unhealthy. Parents, they're the 'cause they're yours. They can't toddle off at 3 down to the McDonald's store and get a Happy Meal. They're in your care, so make it count.
All right, so they can avoid going to concentration camps.
I think we ought to lock them up otherwise.
All right, we're kidding.
You know, it's called child abuse, what you're doing in name, you know. But I tell you, I had a mother, God bless her, she loved her children. And guess what her expression of love was?
Cookies, cakes, pies.
Well, food,
Yeah.
food. You can't believe
Any
how
kind
much
of-
food we ate. I mean, it was just unbelievable. I mean, it's
But
just...
back in the day, it was probably, you know, the good ingredients, you know.
Yeah, well, it's
not-
good ingredients, you still got fat. But it not as fast as we do now. But that was a sign of love. I love my children, and therefore I'm going to have a cake, or I'm going to have ice cream, or I'm going to have a big roast, or I'm going to have, you know, waffles or something. I mean, there's all these things that we ate.
Yeah. But
Man, I ate a lot when I was a kid.
oh, you've redeemed it.
Well, it took a while to do it, though.
Radical Muslims in Iraq stole nearly everything from the Christians they threatened to kill. Hundreds of Christians have been fleeing from Iraq's second biggest city, Mosul. Last week, the terrorist group Islamic State told Christians to either convert to Islam, pay a protection tax, or die. Those who fled left most of their belongings behind, but Islamic State gunmen stopped them at checkpoints and stole much of what they did manage to take. Virginia Congressman Frank Wolf told Congress Tuesday the attacks on Iraqi Christians constitute genocide and a crime against humanity. A Christian ministry to children in Portland, Oregon is being met with opposition. The Child Evangelism Fellowship is hosting evangelism and discipleship gatherings throughout the city this week for kids between 5 and 12. They're called Good News Clubs, but opponents took out a full-page newspaper ad to protest the outreach. They say the group represents a fundamentalist view of Christianity that should be rejected. Child Evangelism Fellowship's vice president says the group is trying to engage a younger audience that may not have heard the gospel, and the opposition is part of an atheist plan to dismantle Christian outreach. Well, you can always get the latest from CBN News by going to our website, cbnnews.com.